As someone who is disabled and lives in a wheelchair, let me tell you how I got rid of a pervert who tried to enter my house. My name is Donald and I've been in a wheelchair for about 8 years. I lost my ability to walk in a car accident years ago. I've adapted quite well to living in a wheelchair. I work from home as a web designer and live in a ranch-style house that's been completely renovated for accessibility. Ramps, wider doors, a roll-in shower, it's all there. I'm not telling you this to sympathize, I'm telling you this because it's important for what happens next. I've lived in this house for about 3 years. It's in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people still wave to each other from their driveways. Most of my neighbors are elderly, retired people who spend their days gardening and walking their dogs. They've all been very welcoming since I moved in. My next-door neighbor sometimes brings me cookies, and the gentleman across the street always offers to help if I need to move something heavy. It's a nice place to live, or at least it was. The backyard was one of the main reasons I bought this house. It's fully enclosed with a 6-foot privacy fence, and there's a concrete patio that extends all the way from the back door to about halfway into the yard. From there, it transitions to a nice lawn with some mature oak trees for shade. I spend a lot of time out there, especially during the warmer months. I've got a setup with outdoor speakers and a small table where I can work on my laptop when the weather's nice. It's peaceful, private, and I never had to worry about anyone bothering me. That changed about 6 months ago. I first noticed it on a Tuesday evening. I was outside working on a client's website. The sun was beginning to set, and as I considered going inside, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up and saw someone standing by the back fence. The angle and the shadows from the trees made it hard to make out the details, but it was definitely a person. They were standing there completely motionless, facing my yard. At first I thought maybe it was one of the neighbors dealing with something on their side of the fence. The houses behind me back up to mine, so it wouldn't be unusual for someone to be in their backyard. I waved, thinking they might wave back, but they didn't move. They just stood there. After a few minutes, I started to feel uncomfortable. I called out, "Hey there, everything okay?" but got no response. The figure just remained motionless. Eventually, I decided to go inside. As I was wheeling toward the back door, I glanced over my shoulder and they were gone. I didn't think too much about it that first time. Like I said, it could have been a neighbor, or maybe someone who got lost and was trying to figure out where they were. But then it happened again, 2 nights later. Same time of evening, same spot at the fence. This time I was more alert to it. I watched for a few minutes, and whoever it was never moved. They just stood there, and from what I could tell, they were looking directly at me. I tried taking a picture with my phone, but the distance and lighting made it impossible to see anything clearly. Over the next couple of weeks, it became a regular thing. Almost every evening when I went outside, there they were, always in the same spot, always perfectly still. I started paying closer attention to the timing. It was always between 7 and 8 p.m., and they would stay for anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour before disappearing. I never saw them arrive or leave. They would just be there one moment and gone the next. The whole thing was starting to really bother me. I'm not generally a paranoid person, but there was something unsettling about being watched like that, and the fact that I was in a wheelchair made it worse. If someone wanted to cause trouble, I couldn't exactly run away. I started making excuses to stay inside during those evening hours, which really pissed me off. This was my house, my yard, and I shouldn't have to hide from some creep. After about a month of this, I decided to do something about it. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The officer I spoke to was polite but didn't seem particularly concerned. He said unless the person was actually on my property or threatening me directly, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I try talking to my neighbors to see if they'd noticed anything unusual. I hung up feeling more frustrated than before. I did talk to Mrs. Patterson the next day when I saw her getting her mail. She's in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and spends a lot of time looking out her windows. If anyone would have noticed something, it would be her. When I described what I'd been seeing, her expression changed. "Oh, honey," she said, lowering her voice. "I was wondering when you'd bring this up. I've seen him too." That sent a chill through me. Him? Yes, it's definitely a man. Tall, wearing dark clothes. He doesn't just watch your yard, Donald. Sometimes he walks along the fence line behind all our houses. I've seen him 3 or 4 times in the past month, always in the evening. I called the police about it, but they said the same thing they told you. Knowing that Mrs. Patterson had seen him too somehow made it worse. It meant I wasn't imagining things, but it also meant this person was actively stalking the neighborhood. And based on the timing, it seemed like they were particularly interested in my yard. That night, I decided not to go inside anymore. Around 7:15, I went out onto the porch, positioned my chair facing the back fence and waited. A moment later, someone appeared. This time, I was ready. I pulled out my phone and managed to zoom in as close as I could. I still couldn't make out his features, but I could confirm it was a man, probably in his 30s or 40s, wearing a dark hoodie. Mrs. Patterson was right, he was tall. What really got to me was how he didn't try to hide. He just stood there in the open, staring. It felt like a challenge, like he wanted me to know he was watching. After about 20 minutes, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind the fence. I spent that night researching security cameras. By the next afternoon, I had ordered a system with 4 wireless cameras that I could monitor from my phone. The installation was a pain in the ass. Trying to mount cameras at the right height when you're in a wheelchair is not easy. But I managed to get 2 cameras covering the back fence area and 1 covering each side of the house. The cameras changed everything. Not because they caught anything at first, but because they gave me a sense of control. I could check the live feed anytime I wanted, and I set up motion alerts so I'd know if anyone was moving around outside. For about a week, the motion alerts only picked up cats and the occasional squirrel. Then, one Thursday night, around 11:30 p.m., I received an alert. I was already in bed, but I grabbed my phone and checked the feed. There he was, but this time he wasn't at the back fence. He was standing in my side yard, just a few feet from my bedroom window. The camera angle was perfect, and for the first time I could see his face clearly. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with short brown hair and stubble. What struck me most was his expression. He wasn't trying to be sneaky or furtive. He was just standing there, calm and patient, looking directly at my window. The scariest part was that he seemed to be looking right at the camera, like he knew it was there and didn't care. I watched him for about 10 minutes, my heart pounding. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He raised his hand and waved at the camera. Not a friendly wave, but a slow, deliberate gesture that felt like a taunt. After that, he walked away. I called 911 immediately. The dispatcher took my information and said they were sending a car. By the time the officers arrived about 15 minutes later, the man was long gone, but I had him on video. The officers watched the footage and agreed it was concerning, especially given that he'd waved at the camera. They took a copy of the video and said they'd file a report, but warned me that unless he actually trespassed on my property or made threats, their options were limited. "What about the fact that I'm disabled?" I asked. "Doesn't that make this harassment or something?" The younger officer looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we understand your concerns, and you're right to be worried, but legally, standing in a public area and looking at someone's house isn't a crime, even if it's creepy as hell. What I'd suggest is making sure all your doors and windows are locked. Maybe consider upgrading your security system." After they left, I felt more vulnerable than ever. This wasn't some random creep who happened to walk by my house. This was someone who was specifically targeting me, and the fact that I used a wheelchair clearly factored into it somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that he saw me as an easy target. The next few nights were quiet, but I barely slept. Every little sound had me checking the camera feeds. I started keeping my phone charging right next to my bed so I could monitor the alerts constantly. I also moved a baseball bat within reach, though I knew it wouldn't be much good if someone actually broke in while I was sleeping. Sunday night, things got out of hand. I was watching TV in the living room when I got a motion alert from the back fence camera. I checked the footage and saw him, but this time he had a flashlight. He used it to inspect my fence, running his hands along the boards as if searching for weak spots or gaps. Then he headed for the door, the only way into my backyard, through the alley behind the houses. I watched in horror as he tried the gate latch. It was locked, but he spent several minutes working at it with something in his hands. I couldn't see exactly what he was doing from the camera angle, but it looked like he might have been trying to pick the lock. After about 10 minutes, he gave up and walked away. I called 911 again, but by the time the police arrived, he was gone. This time, though, there was evidence. When the officers checked the gate, they found scratches around the lock that hadn't been there before. Fresh metal shavings were scattered on the ground where someone had been working at it with tools. "This changes things," the older officer said. "Attempted breaking and entering, even if he didn't succeed. If we can identify this guy, we can charge him." They took more detailed photos and measurements and promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood. I also gave them several more video clips showing the man at different times over the past few weeks. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like the police were taking it seriously. The next morning, I had a security company come out to upgrade my system. They installed additional cameras, motion sensor lights, and reinforced locks on all my doors and windows. They also set up a panic button system that would immediately alert both the police and the security company if I pressed it. For 3 days, everything was silent. No sign of movement, no sign of a stalker. I began to think the police presence had frightened him away. Then, late one night, I was awakened by a scratching sound. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the sound. It was definitely a scratching sound, like nails on wood, and it seemed to be coming from the living room. My first thought was that it might be a mouse or rat that had crawled into the walls, but the sound was so rhythmic and deliberate. I grabbed my phone to check the security cameras, but the live feed showed nothing outside. All the motion sensors were quiet. Whatever was making the noise, it was inside the house with me. I reached for the baseball bat and the panic button simultaneously. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold either one. The scratching continued, seeming to move along the wall from the living room toward the kitchen. Then I heard something that made me want to scream, the sound of my refrigerator door opening. I pressed the panic button and immediately called 911. The dispatcher could hear the terror in my voice as I whispered that someone was in my house. She stayed on the line with me while I listened to whoever it was moving around in my kitchen, opening and closing cabinets. The scariest part was how casual it sounded. This person wasn't rushing or trying to be quiet. They were moving through my house like they belonged there, like they were familiar with the layout. I could hear sirens in the distance when the kitchen sound stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard my back door open and close. By the time the police arrived, whoever it was had escaped through the backyard. The officers searched the house thoroughly and found signs that someone had definitely been inside. The kitchen window above the sink, the one window I hadn't been able to get security mesh installed on because of the way the cabinets were positioned, had been jimmied open. It was just wide enough for someone to climb through, though it would have been a tight squeeze. More disturbing were the items that had been moved. Several of my prescription bottles had been taken out of a cabinet and arranged in a neat line on the counter. A kitchen knife was missing from the block, though we never found it. And most unsettling of all, there were muddy footprints leading from the kitchen to my bedroom door. "He was in your bedroom," one of the officers said grimly. "These prints go right up to your door and back." The thought of this pervert standing outside my bedroom while I was asleep was almost unbearable. What would have happened if I hadn't woken up? The police were now treating this as a serious crime. They scanned me for fingerprints, took detailed photos, and interviewed all my neighbors. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. Mrs. Patterson let me sleep on her couch, and I gratefully accepted. I arranged for a friend to pick me up the next day, and I stayed with my family while the police continued their investigation. That week, police made an arrest. He had a history of burglary charges, often targeting homes whose residents he deemed vulnerable. The police found my missing kitchen knife in his apartment, along with photos of my house and several other homes in the neighborhood. He never explained why he specifically targeted me, but during questioning, he made it clear that my disability was a factor, mentioning the man in the wheelchair several times. He seemed to believe I wouldn't be able to defend myself or escape if he decided to escalate his behavior. He was right in a way, but what he didn't take into account was my security system, my relationships with my neighbors, and my determination not to be a victim. I finally moved back into my home and made significant additional security improvements. The house now has a comprehensive alarm system, security gates, and motion sensors. I also acquired an excellent watchdog, trained to assist people with disabilities. This whole experience has changed me. I'm now more cautious and more aware of my surroundings, but I'm also proud of how I handled it. I didn't let fear drive me away from my home permanently, and I didn't let this disgusting man turn me into a victim. Being in a wheelchair doesn't make me helpless. Years ago, I had a diving accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. I have a job that allows me to work from home. I work as a customer service representative for a tech company, working mostly night shifts. My setup is pretty good. I have a home office with an adjustable desk, multiple monitors, and a really comfortable chair where I can spend 8 hours without much discomfort. The house I rent is small in an older neighborhood. It's not luxurious, but it's enough for me. The only downside is that the neighborhood is changing. Some houses are now vacant, and there's been an increase in petty crime in the past year. My work schedule is Sunday through Thursday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It suits me fine because I can run errands and handle appointments during normal business hours on weekdays, and I have my weekends free. Most of my neighbors are asleep during my work hours, so the neighborhood is usually dead quiet, which I actually prefer. My home office is in what used to be the second bedroom at the front of the house. There's a large window that looks out onto the street, and I usually keep the blinds closed while I'm working because the glow from my monitors can be seen from outside. I learned that lesson the hard way during my first week. I had a neighbor knock on my door at 2 a.m. asking if I was okay because my lights were on all night. About 2 months ago, I started noticing a car that would park across the street during my shifts. At first, I didn't think much of it. Street parking is legal, and maybe someone was visiting one of my neighbors or having car trouble. But after it happened several nights in a row, I started paying more attention. The car was a dark sedan, maybe 10 years old, with tinted windows. It would usually show up sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., and it would stay parked there until just before dawn. I never saw anyone get in or out of it during my work hours. It would just sit there, silent and motionless. What aroused suspicion was its location. The car was always parked directly across from my house and angled so the driver could clearly see my windshield. Even though I kept my curtains closed, there were still small gaps where someone could see the light from my computer screens and possibly make out my silhouette moving across the seat. About a week later, I started watching the car more closely. During one of my breaks, I went to the window and peered through the curtains. For the first time, I could definitely see someone in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out any details because of the tinted windows and the darkness, but it was clear someone was sitting there. The thought that someone was spending hours watching my house while I worked was deeply unsettling. I started to wonder if they knew I was disabled, if they were casing the place for a robbery, or if it was something even worse. Being alone in the house during overnight hours suddenly felt much more vulnerable. I decided to start documenting what I was seeing. Every night when the car appeared, I would note the time, take pictures if possible, and try to get a look at the license plate. The plate was hard to read from my window, but I managed to make out a few partial characters. After 2 weeks of documentation, I called the police. The non-emergency dispatcher listened to my concerns but said that parking on a public street wasn't illegal, even if it seemed suspicious. They offered to have a patrol car drive by during my shift, which I appreciated, but I knew that wouldn't solve the problem long term. The patrol car did drive by a few times over the next several nights, and interestingly, the sedan didn't appear on those nights. But as soon as the police presence ended, it was back. I started varying my routine to see if that would make a difference. Some nights I would turn my office light off and work in darkness, using only the glow from my monitors. Other nights I would leave the light on but move to a different part of the house for part of my shift. The car appeared regardless, suggesting that whoever it was knew my general schedule and wasn't just responding to visible signs of activity. The situation escalated 3 weeks later. I was working a particularly busy shift. We were dealing with a server outage that had customers calling all night, when I noticed something different. Instead of staying in the car, someone was standing on the sidewalk across from my house. It was around morning, and I only noticed him when I looked up from my computer at just the right moment. He was partially hidden behind a tree, but I could tell he was a male, probably of average height and build, wearing dark clothing, and he was definitely watching my house. I quickly closed my job applications and called 911. This wasn't just street parking, it was someone actively cruising around my neighborhood in the middle of the night, clearly focused on my house. The dispatcher took my information and said they would send a car right away. I stayed on the line with her while I watched the man outside. He seemed completely unaware that I had spotted him, just standing there motionlessly, facing my house. When the police car turned onto my street about 8 minutes later, the man disappeared, not ran away, just vanished between one moment and the next. The officers searched the area but found no one. I went outside to meet with the officers. Wheeling my chair down the ramp was awkward at 3 a.m., but I wanted to give them as much information as possible. They were more concerned about this incident than the previous reports about the parked car. An officer suggested that because I worked overnight shifts and was home alone, I might be seen as an easy target for someone planning a break-in. The fact that you're in a wheelchair might be a factor too, one of the officers said bluntly. Some criminals specifically target people they perceive as unable to fight back or escape easily. That was exactly what I had been afraid to hear, but I appreciated his honesty. The officers took a detailed report and promised to increase patrols in the area during overnight hours. They also suggested I consider upgrading my home security system and maybe alerting my neighbors to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. For the next few nights, everything seemed normal. No strange cars, no lurking figures. I began to suspect that the police visit had scared off whoever it was. But then, one night, things changed. I was in the middle of a client meeting when I heard a sound that didn't belong there, the distinct creak of the steps on my back porch. The sound was faint, but I knew my house well enough to recognize it immediately. Someone was on my back porch. I muted my call and listened carefully. There it was again, the soft groan of wood under weight, like someone was slowly and carefully climbing the steps. My back door was at the far end of the house from my office, but in the nighttime quiet, sounds carried clearly. I finished the customer call as quickly as possible, then wheeled over to the back of the house to investigate. My kitchen and back door area weren't visible from the street, which made them perfect for someone who didn't want to be seen approaching the house. I turned off the kitchen lights and carefully looked out the window in the back door. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something that made my heart skip. The motion sensor light that should have activated when someone stepped onto the porch was not working. The bulb wasn't burned out. I could see it clearly, but it wasn't turning on. Someone had either unscrewed the bulb or cut the wire to disable it. I immediately called 911 again, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was on my property and had tampered with my security lighting. She kept me on the line while dispatching officers to my location. While I waited for the police, I tried to see if I could spot whoever was out there. I couldn't see anyone on the porch from the kitchen window, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The porch wrapped around to the side of the house, and there were several spots where someone could hide. What scared me most was the methodical nature of what they had done. Disabling the motion light showed planning and familiarity with my property. This wasn't some random opportunist. It was someone who had been watching my house long enough to know about the light and figure out how to disable it. The police arrived about 6 minutes later, but once again, by the time they got there, whoever it was had disappeared. This time, though, there was clear evidence of tampering. The motion sensor light had been carefully unscrewed and set aside, indicating someone had come prepared with tools. There were also fresh footprints in the soft dirt around my back porch. Most disturbing of all, the officers found tool marks on my back door around the lock area. Someone had been working at the lock, though they apparently hadn't succeeded in opening it. "This is escalating," one of the officers told me. "You need to take serious precautions." The police took detailed photos and measurements, and they collected the unscrewed light bulb for fingerprinting. They also strongly recommended that I consider staying somewhere else for a few days while they investigated. I followed their advice and arranged to stay with my sister across town. I couldn't afford time off work, so I brought my laptop and worked my shifts from her guest room. It was inconvenient and uncomfortable, but it felt safer than staying at home. Because I was away for 3 days, the police increased patrols in my neighborhood and spoke with several neighbors. One neighbor said he saw the dark-colored sedan I'd reported and that he'd seen someone walking in the alley behind our house at least twice. More importantly, the fingerprints from the light bulb matched. He was a man with a criminal record for burglary, stalking, and assault. His most recent conviction was targeting a single, physically disabled woman. The police issued an arrest warrant for him, but when they went to his last known address, they found he had been evicted a week earlier. His current whereabouts were unknown. Knowing that this man was still at large and had a history of targeting people with disabilities made me afraid to return home. But I couldn't stay with my sister forever. I needed to return to my normal routine. I worked with the police and a security company to significantly improve the security of my home. We installed a comprehensive alarm system that included door and window sensors, motion detectors throughout the house, and cameras covering all entrances and exits. I also installed security film on all my windows and updated the locks on all the doors. Most importantly, I arranged for a friend to stay with me during my work hours until the man was caught. Henry is a former soldier who doesn't mind staying up all night, and his presence made me feel much safer. The new security system paid off after just 3 days. At 12:50 a.m., perimeter motion sensors detected someone approaching my house from the backyard. The cameras clearly showed the man heading towards my back door with what appeared to be a toolbox in his hand. This time we were ready for him. Henry called 911 while I watched the cameras from my office. We watched the stalker work at my back door until police sirens could be heard in the distance. He tried to escape, but officers stationed at both ends of the alley behind my house caught him before he could escape. When he was apprehended, he had lockpicks, screwdrivers, and other burglary tools with him. He also had detailed notes about my home, my work schedule, and my disability. During interrogation, he admitted he had been watching me for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to break in. His plan was to physically overpower me and then burglarize the house whenever he felt like it. The notes the police found were chilling. He observed me working alone at night, noted my breaks, and even recorded details about my wheelchair and limited mobility. It was clear he had planned this for a long time. I still work night shifts, but I'm much more security conscious now. I keep all my blinds closed while I'm working, have multiple layers of security monitoring my property, and have maintained relationships with several neighbors who keep watch over me during my work hours. This whole experience has taught me that being disabled can be a target for criminals who see weakness where others see strength. But it has also taught me that with the proper preparation and support systems, I don't have to be a victim. I still carry the fear of what I went through, but I won't let fear drive me from my home or change my career. My name is Fiona, and I'd like to share with you something that happened last year and still keeps me up at night. I'm 29 years old and use a wheelchair due to a walking disability. After college, I lived with roommates for a few years, but I'd longed for my own place. The challenge was finding a place that was both affordable and accessible. Most of the affordable apartments I looked at had steps, narrow doorways, or other obstacles that made it impossible for me to move independently. When I found the basement apartment, it seemed too good to be true. It was in a converted house in an older neighborhood, with a separate entrance that had been fitted with a ramp. The rent was reasonable. It had been modified with wider doorways and an accessible bathroom, and it was available immediately. The landlord, an older man named Mr. James, seemed nice enough and said he'd had the modifications made for a previous tenant who had also used a wheelchair. The apartment itself was essentially one large room with a small kitchen area and a bathroom. It wasn't luxurious, but it was perfect for me. The main living area had 2 windows at ground level, one overlooking the street and the other the backyard. Being a basement, the windows were quite high up on the walls from my perspective, but they did provide natural light and made the space feel less claustrophobic. The apartment was quiet, comfortable, and finally gave me the independence I'd longed for. Since I work as a freelance designer, I spend most of my time at home. The first sign that something was wrong came about a month after I moved in. One evening, while working late on a project, I heard footsteps above me. This wasn't unusual. Mr. James lived upstairs and moved frequently. But these footsteps were different. They were slow and careful, as if they were pacing back and forth in the room directly above me. What made it strange was the pattern. The footsteps would start at one end of the room, walk slowly to the other end, pause for a moment, then return. This went on for about 20 minutes before stopping. It was probably nothing, but something about the rhythm felt off, like someone was deliberately trying to make noise or get my attention. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to the sounds from upstairs. The pacing happened again 2 nights later. Same time, same pattern. When I mentioned it to Mr. James the next time I saw him, he seemed surprised. "Pacing? That's odd. I don't recall doing that," he said. "Though I suppose I might walk around sometimes when I'm thinking about something. Old habits die hard." He seemed genuinely puzzled, which made me feel better. I figured maybe he was dealing with some stress and wasn't aware of his own behavior patterns. But then I started hearing Mr. James's footsteps when his car wasn't in the driveway. One day I saw Mr. James leave his house in the afternoon. He usually went shopping and ran errands in the afternoon. But a little later I heard the same deliberate footsteps clearly in the room above me. He paced for about 15 minutes before stopping. When Mr. James returned home, I went upstairs to ask him. He looked confused and said he had been at the shop and then stopped by for coffee with a friend. When I heard his footsteps, he was definitely not home. "Maybe the house is settling," he suggested. "These old places make all kinds of noises." I knew the difference between random house settling and deliberate footsteps, but I didn't want to argue with him. Still, the incident left me feeling uneasy. Over the next couple of weeks, the mysterious footsteps became more frequent. They always followed the same pattern, slow pacing back and forth in the room above me, usually lasting 15 to 20 minutes. And they were clearly happening when Mr. James wasn't home. I started keeping a log of when I heard the sounds and when I saw Mr. James's car come and go. There was definitely no correlation. The footsteps were happening whether he was home or not. One evening I decided to investigate. When I heard the pacing start around 9 p.m., I quietly wheeled myself outside and around to the back of the house to see if I could see anything through the upstairs windows. The house was dark except for Mr. James's bedroom, where I could see the glow of his television. The room where the pacing was coming from was completely dark. As I sat there looking up at the dark window, the footsteps suddenly stopped. After a moment of silence, a figure appeared at the window. It was just a silhouette against the darkness inside, but someone was definitely there, looking down at me. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that whoever was up there had been watching me from above this whole time. They weren't just pacing randomly, they were monitoring my movements from the room directly over my apartment. The figure at the window remained motionless for what felt like several minutes, just staring down at me. Then slowly, they stepped back from the window and disappeared into the darkness. I wheeled myself back inside as quickly and quietly as possible, my heart pounding. Someone had been in Mr. James' house, in the room above me, and they clearly knew I was down here. The fact that they had appeared at the window the moment I went outside suggested they had been watching me through the floor somehow, or at least listening to my movements very carefully. I immediately went upstairs and knocked on Mr. James' door. He answered in his robe, clearly having been watching TV in bed. "Fiona, is everything okay?" he asked, looking concerned. "Mr. James, there's someone in your house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In the room above my apartment. I just saw them at the window." His face went pale. "What? That's impossible. I've been here all evening." "I know you have, but someone else is up there. I heard the pacing, and when I went outside to look, I saw a person at the window." Mr. James grabbed a flashlight and we went to check the room above my apartment. It was his spare bedroom, and it appeared empty. But as we looked around, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were clear indentations in the carpet where someone had been pacing back and forth, exactly in the pattern I had been hearing. More disturbing, when Mr. James checked the window, he found that the lock was broken. The window could be opened from the outside. "Someone's been getting in through this window," he said grimly, "probably using a ladder or climbing up from the back porch roof. I need to call the police." The police arrived about 20 minutes later and searched the house thoroughly. They found no one inside, but they did find evidence that someone had been entering the house regularly. In addition to the broken window lock, there were muddy footprints on the windowsill and scratches on the wall where someone had been climbing in and out. Most unsettling of all, they found a small hole that had been drilled through the floor of the spare bedroom, a hole that looked down directly into my apartment. It was positioned so that someone lying on the floor above could see most of my living space, including my bed. "Someone's been watching you," one of the officers said bluntly. "This hole wasn't here when you moved in, was it?" I felt sick. No, definitely not. I would have noticed something like that. The officer took photos and measurements and recommended that both Mr. James and I consider staying somewhere else while they investigated. They also suggested that I might have been specifically targeted because of my disability. Some criminals look for people they think will have difficulty defending themselves or escaping, the officer explained. The fact that you're in a wheelchair, living alone in a basement apartment, might have made you seem like an easy target. That night I stayed with a friend, but I couldn't sleep. The thought that someone had been watching me from above for weeks, seeing everything I did in what I thought was the privacy of my own home, was horrifying. They had seen me sleeping, working, eating, everything. Mr. James called a security company the next day to install better locks on all the windows and a simple alarm system, but I still didn't feel safe returning to the apartment. I kept thinking about that hole in the floor and wondering how long someone had been watching me before I noticed the footsteps. 2 days later, the police called with an update. They had found fingerprints on the windowsill belonging to a man with a record of burglary and voyeurism. This man had previously been arrested and imprisoned for a similar offense. The police obtained an arrest warrant for this pervert, but when they went to his address, they couldn't find him at home. Knowing that this man was still at large, had a history of stalking women, and was particularly interested in watching me, made it impossible for me to return to the basement apartment. Despite the enhanced security, I couldn't get past the fact that he knew where I lived and had been observing my routines for weeks. I decided to terminate my lease and find a new one, despite the financial hardship this would cause. Miss James was understanding and didn't charge me a penalty fee, especially since the security breach occurred on his property. Finding a new accessible apartment quickly proved difficult, but I eventually found one on the second floor of a building with an elevator and good security. It was more expensive, but being above ground floor and having other tenants nearby made me feel safer. 3 weeks after I moved out of the basement apartment, the police caught the stalker. He had apparently returned to Mr. James's house, hoping to continue his surveillance. Mr. James had installed motion detecting cameras after I moved in, and they caught him climbing through the same window he had previously used. When the police searched the stalker's house, they found it filled with photos and videos of women he had taken through windows and holes drilled in the walls. Many of the women were disabled or elderly, people the stalker considered vulnerable. He had taken detailed notes about their routines, including extensive notes about me and my daily schedule. During his interrogation, he admitted to having been watching me for almost 2 months before noticing the footsteps. He had discovered the basement apartment by chance while searching for vacant properties to break into, and when he saw me move in, he decided I would be the perfect target for extended surveillance. The most chilling part was his explanation of why he chose me. He said that since I use a wheelchair and live alone in a basement apartment, he was sure I wouldn't be able to chase him or run away if he decided to do more than just watch. I testified at the sentencing hearing and told the court that being in a wheelchair didn't make me helpless. While the pervert thought my disability made me an easy target, it was actually my awareness and quick thinking that led to his capture. I may not have been able to chase a pervert, but I was smart enough to recognize something was wrong and persistent enough to ask for help. This whole experience has changed my perspective on home and personal safety. I now live on the second floor, have multiple locks on my door, and a security system that alerts both me and the police if someone tries to break in. I also made sure my new landlord knew I was in a wheelchair, not to make them see me as vulnerable, but to make them understand that I needed to be able to get out quickly in an emergency. I still work mostly from home as a freelance designer and cherish my independence, but I'm now much more aware of how my disability can make me appear to criminals looking for easy targets. The key is to be prepared and vigilant, not to let fear control your life. My name is Gordon, and I've lived in this house alone for 3 years. The accident that confined me to this wheelchair happened when I was 35, a construction accident that fractured my spine and changed everything about my life. I'm 38 now and quite good at managing on my own. The house is a 1-story ranch house that I modified for accessibility after receiving the severance pay. Ramps, wider doors, lowered countertops, everything. It's not fancy, but it's mine and it's manageable. The neighborhood is quiet, mostly older people and young families. I mostly hang out by myself, but my neighbors are friendly enough. I do accounting for a small business from home, so I don't have to go out much except for grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. The house sits on a corner lot with large windows facing both the street and the side yard. I like having lots of natural light, especially since I spend most of my time indoors. The windows are all at a height that I can see out of easily from my wheelchair, which was one of the selling points when I bought the place. It started about 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning. I was making coffee in the kitchen when I noticed something on the window above the sink. At first I thought it was just smudges from rain or maybe a bird had flown into the glass. But when I got closer I could see they were clearly handprints. 5 fingers pressed against the outside of the glass about shoulder height for someone standing outside. The prints were fresh. You could see the oil from someone's skin clearly outlined on the glass. What struck me as odd was their position. They weren't at the bottom of the window like you'd expect if someone was just trying to look inside. They were right in the center, as if someone had deliberately placed their hands there. I figured it was probably Thomas or one of the other neighborhood kids playing around. Kids touch everything, right? I cleaned the prints off and didn't think much more about it. But the next morning, they were back. Same window, same position, same size. Fresh handprints on glass I had just cleaned the day before. This time I was more curious. The prints were too high to be from a child, and they were positioned too deliberately to be accidental. Someone was intentionally pressing their hands against my kitchen window during the night. I started paying attention to all my windows after that. Over the next few days, I found handprints on 3 different windows. The kitchen window, the living room window facing the street, and my bedroom window facing the side yard. Always in the same spots, always at about the same height, always fresh in the morning. The pattern was consistent. I would clean the prints off during the day, and they would be back the next morning. Whoever was doing this was visiting my house every single night. At first I was more annoyed than scared. Some prankster was messing with me, and I didn't appreciate it. But as the days went by, I started feeling unsettled. The handprints weren't random. They were always in the exact same positions on each window. That suggested someone was taking time to be precise about where they placed them. After a week of this, I decided to set up a camera. I had an old webcam from my computer setup that I positioned to watch the kitchen window. If someone was going to keep leaving prints, I wanted to see who it was. The first night with the camera, I stayed up until about 2 a.m. watching the feed on my laptop, but nothing happened. I finally went to sleep, and when I woke up, there were fresh handprints on the kitchen window, but the camera showed nothing. Somehow, whoever was doing this had avoided being seen. I reviewed the footage carefully, but there was no sign of anyone approaching the window. The prints just appeared sometime between 2:30 and 6 a.m., but I couldn't see how. That's when I started to get really worried. Either someone was incredibly skilled at avoiding detection, or something very strange was going on. But every morning there would be fresh handprints somewhere, and the camera never caught anything. After 2 weeks of this, I was exhausted and frustrated. The nightly appearance of the handprints was messing with my sleep and my peace of mind. I started closing all my blinds at night and checking every window before bed, but it didn't matter. The prints kept appearing. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. I was cleaning the handprints off my bedroom window one morning when I realized they weren't just random palm prints. There was a pattern to them. The way the fingers were spread, the angle of the thumbs, it looked deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate something. I started documenting the prints before cleaning them off, taking photos and noting their exact positions. After a few days of this, I printed out all the photos and laid them out on my kitchen table. That's when I saw it. The handprints weren't just touching the glass randomly, they were pointing. Each print was angled slightly, with the fingers indicating a direction. When I traced the directions from each window, they all pointed toward the same area, my basement. I don't use my basement much since the accident. It's not accessible without going downstairs, and I haven't had any reason to modify it. It's just storage space now, full of boxes and old furniture from before my life changed. But according to the handprints, someone wanted me to pay attention to what was down there. The next morning, I asked Thomas from across the street to help me check out the basement. He's a good kid, maybe 16, and he's helped me with things before when I needed someone to go places I couldn't reach. Just take a look around and tell me if you see anything unusual, I told him. Old boxes, furniture, nothing should look different, but let me know if something seems out of place. Thomas went down while I waited at the top of the stairs. After about 10 minutes, he called back up to me. "Mr. Gordon, there's something weird down here. There's like a hole in the wall, and it looks fresh. A hole in the wall." I had lived in this house for 3 years and never noticed any structural damage in the basement. "Can you describe it?" I called down. "It's about the size of a person maybe, like someone knocked through the foundation wall from outside, and there's dirt and stuff on the floor like someone's been digging." My blood went cold. Someone had been digging into my basement from outside. That explained how the handprints were appearing without anyone being caught on camera. Whoever was doing this wasn't approaching from the street or the yard. They were coming from underground. "Thomas, get up here right now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. When Thomas came back upstairs, he looked shaken. "Mr. Gordon, I think someone's been living down there. There's like a sleeping bag and some food wrappers in the corner. And there are weird scratches on the walls, like tallies or something." I immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they went down to investigate and confirmed what Thomas had found. Someone had tunneled into my basement from outside, probably starting from the storm drain that ran behind my property. They had been using my basement as some kind of shelter or hideout. More disturbing were the scratches Thomas had mentioned. They weren't random, they were dates going back almost 2 months. Whoever had been down there had been keeping track of their time in my house. But the most unsettling discovery was in the corner where the sleeping bag was. There was a collection of photographs, pictures of me taken through my windows, showing me cooking, working, sleeping. Someone had been watching me for weeks before they started leaving the handprints. The police found evidence that the person living in my basement had been moving around the house at night, coming up through the basement door that opened into my utility room. They had been in my house while I was sleeping, moving around freely. The handprints were probably their way of letting you know they were here without directly confronting you, one of the officers explained. Some burglars or stalkers like to play psychological games with their victims before escalating to more direct contact. The thought that someone had been in my house every night for weeks, walking around while I slept, was absolutely terrifying. The fact that I was in a wheelchair made me feel even more vulnerable. If this person had decided to confront me directly, I wouldn't have been able to run or escape easily. The police set up surveillance around my house and searched for the intruder, but whoever it was had disappeared when they realized their basement hideout had been discovered. They left behind the photographs, the sleeping bag, and the scratched-out calendar, but no clear indication of who they were. A week later, they caught him. He was a homeless man named Martin. He broke into houses and lived in basements or attics without the owner's knowledge. He had been watching my house for weeks before digging the tunnel, searching for a safe place. During questioning, he admitted that he had chosen my house specifically because he had noticed I was in a wheelchair and living alone. He said he thought if I did, I would be less likely to notice his presence or be unable to do anything about it. The handprints were supposed to be a message, he told the police. I was trying to tell him I was grateful for the shelter, that I meant him no harm. I thought maybe if he knew I was there but wasn't causing trouble, he would let me stay. The twisted logic was frightening. Martin had convinced himself that his secret life in my basement, his stalking me, was a favor to both of us. He seemed to genuinely believe that the handprints were a polite form of communication rather than a horrific invasion of privacy. Martin was tried for burglary, stalking, and trespassing. The judge cited the aggravating factor of targeting a disabled person and sentenced him to 2 years in prison. After the pervert was arrested, I completely sealed off the basement. I also installed a comprehensive security system, including motion sensors throughout the house and every room, and cameras covering every entrance and exit. The thought that someone could live in my house for weeks without me knowing was too disturbing to risk it happening again. The hardest part of this whole experience was realizing how vulnerable I had been without realizing it. While I was going about my daily routine, feeling safe and independent in my own home, a stranger was living beneath my feet, watching me, observing my habits. The handprints weren't just a creepy prank. They were proof that my most basic sense of security had been completely compromised. I still live in the same house, but I'm much more vigilant now. I check all my windows every morning, not for handprints anymore, but just to reassure myself that no one has been tampering with my home. I've also gotten to know my neighbors better, so there are more people looking out for unusual activity around my property. The experience taught me that being in a wheelchair does make you a target for certain types of criminals who see disability as vulnerability, but it also taught me that being observant and asking for help when something seems wrong can be the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. I never want to see mysterious handprints on my windows again. But if I do, now I know they're not a message. They're a warning that someone is trying to take away my safety and independence, and I won't let that happen again.